Otis Redding told James Brown, "You've sold out. You're making pop music for white people instead of soul for our people." Brown's face went stone cold. What he said next ended their friendship for 3 years and revealed the truth about artistic integrity, commercial success, and who gets to decide what real soul music is. It was August 1967 at Stax Records in Memphis, Tennessee. The studio on Macklemore Avenue was the heart of Southern soul, gritty, raw, emotional music that came straight from the church and the streets. Stax was where Otis Redding had built his career, where he'd recorded These Arms of Mine and Try a Little Tenderness, where soul music was still pure, still connected to its roots. James Brown wasn't a Stax artist. He recorded for King Records, but he was in Memphis for a show, and someone had suggested he stop by Stax to pay his respects. Brown was at the peak of his commercial success. Papa's Got a Brand New Bag, I Got You, I Feel Good, and Cold Sweat had crossed over to pop charts. He was on television, playing for integrated audiences, making real money for the first time in his career. Otis Redding was there that afternoon, working on new material. At 26 years old, he was soul music's most emotionally powerful voice, raw, vulnerable, honest. He sang like his heart was breaking with every note. He represented everything Stax stood for: authenticity over commerciality, feeling over technique, soul over pop. When Brown walked into the studio, the session musicians greeted him with respect. Booker T. Jones was there, Steve Cropper, Duck Dunn, the legendary Stax House Band. They knew Brown's impact, knew his innovations. But there was a tension in the air. Stax and King Records had different philosophies, different approaches to soul music. Otis came out of the recording booth when he heard Brown had arrived. The two men shook hands, smiled, exchanged pleasantries. But anyone paying attention could feel something underneath, a competitive edge, a difference in worldview that had been building for years. They talked for a while about music, about the industry, about upcoming shows. Then Otis said something that changed the temperature in the room. "James, I gotta ask you something. What happened to you, man?" Brown's smile faded slightly. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you used to be one of us, raw, real. Now every time I turn on the radio, you're doing these slick, produced records, pop arrangements. You're making music for white teenagers instead of our people. You've sold out." The studio went quiet. The musicians stopped what they were doing. This wasn't playful ribbing. This was a direct challenge to Brown's integrity. Brown's face went stone cold. "You want to talk about selling out, Otis? Let's talk about it." Otis crossed his arms. "I'm just speaking truth. You used to make music that meant something. Please, please, please. That was soul. That was real. Now you're doing dance music. You're entertaining white folks instead of speaking to black folks." Brown stood up slowly. "First of all, Otis, who are you to decide what's real soul and what's not? You think you own the definition? You think because you cry on every record, that's the only authentic way to make music? I'm saying you've lost your way. You're chasing hits instead of making art. You're thinking about chart positions instead of the message." Brown took a step closer. "You're damn right I'm thinking about chart positions. You know why? Because chart positions mean I can eat, mean I can employ musicians, mean I can buy my own tour bus instead of riding in the back of a segregated one, mean I can negotiate from a position of power instead of begging white executives for scraps. But at what cost? You've smoothed out everything that made you special. Where's the grit? Where's the pain? Where's the struggle in your music now?" Brown's voice rose. "The struggle is in being a black man in America trying to make a living off his talent. The struggle is in playing for audiences who won't even let you use the front door of the venue. The struggle is in knowing that every white artist who copies what we do makes 10 times the money. Don't lecture me about struggle, Otis." Steve Cropper quietly suggested they take this conversation somewhere private, but neither man moved. "I'm not lecturing you," Otis said, his voice getting louder. I'm telling you that you had something pure and you traded it for popularity. You had soul and you traded it for sales. You used to make music that healed people. Now you make music that just entertains them. And what's wrong with entertaining people? Brown demanded. What's wrong with making people happy? You think suffering is the only authentic emotion? You think pain is more real than joy? I make music that makes people want to dance, want to move, want to feel good about being alive. That's not selling out. That's serving a different purpose. Otis shook his head. It's not the same, James. When people listen to Try a Little Tenderness, they feel something deep. They connect with something real. When they listen to your new stuff, they just bop their heads and move on. Brown's eyes flashed. First of all, you don't know what people feel when they listen to my music. Second, you're assuming that making people dance is somehow less valuable than making them cry. That's your ego talking, Otis. You think emotional pain is deeper than joy because it makes you feel more like an artist. This isn't about ego, Otis insisted. It's all about ego, Brown fired back. You want to be seen as the authentic one, the pure one, the one who didn't compromise. But let me ask you something. Who produces your records? Who owns Stax? Who distributes your music? White executives. White-owned companies. You're just as much in the system as I am. The only difference is that I've figured out how to make the system work for me, instead of just working for the system. Otis's face reddened. That's not fair. It's completely fair. You talk about making music for our people, but who's buying most of the records? White teenagers. Who's booking you for shows? White promoters. Who's playing your songs on the radio? White DJs. You're selling to the same audience I am. You've just convinced yourself that because your music sounds rawer, you're somehow more legitimate. At least I'm not trying to be something I'm not, Otis said. And what am I trying to be? Brown challenged. Acceptable, palatable, safe. You filed down all the edges that made you dangerous. You used to scare like people. Now you entertain them. Brown stepped even closer now, his voice dropping to something more dangerous than shouting. Let me tell you something, Otis. You think you're so pure, so real, so connected to the struggle. But you know what? You're performing struggle for an audience, just like I'm performing joy. Your pain is just as calculated as my precision. You cry on cue, just like I dance on cue. The only difference is that you've convinced yourself that suffering is more authentic than mastery. That's not true, Otis said, but his voice wavered slightly. It is true, and here's something else that's true. I've created more opportunities for black musicians than your authenticity ever will. I employ a full band. I tour constantly. I own my own masters on some of my records. I'm building something that will last beyond me. What are you building besides a reputation for being real? Otis looked around at the Stax musicians, many of whom were nodding slightly at Brown's words, even if they didn't want to admit it. You don't understand, Otis said, his voice softer now. It's not about the business side. It's about the art. It's about what music is supposed to do. And what's it supposed to do, Otis, according to you? It's supposed to tell the truth. It's supposed to express what we can't say any other way. It's supposed to connect us to something bigger than ourselves. Brown's expression softened just slightly. And you think my music doesn't do that? You think when people hear "Say It Loud, I'm black and I'm proud," they're not connecting to something bigger? You think when they dance to my music, they're not expressing something they can't say any other way? You think joy isn't truth? Otis didn't answer immediately. Let me tell you what I think the problem is, Brown continued. I think you're afraid that if you become too successful, if you cross over to pop charts, if you make white people happy, then you'll lose your connection to the black community. I think you're afraid that commercial success equals selling out, and I think that fear is limiting you. I'm not afraid of success, Otis said. Then what are you afraid of? I'm afraid of losing what makes this music matter. I'm afraid of turning soul music into just another commodity. I'm afraid that if we all chase hits, we'll forget why we started making music in the first place. Brown nodded slowly. Those are legitimate fears. But Otis, we can't stay in the Chitlin circuit forever. We can't keep playing for pennies in segregated clubs and call that purity. At some point, we have to decide whether we want to make music that changes our circumstances or music that just reflects them. It's not that simple, Otis said. But you're standing here judging me for making different choices than you. You're calling me a sellout because I found a way to make money off my talent. Because I figured out how to get played on white radio stations. Because I learned how to cross over without compromising what I do. That's not selling out. That's survival. The room was completely silent now. Everyone was watching these two titans of soul music work through something fundamental about art, commerce, identity, and integrity. Maybe I was wrong to call you a sellout, Otis said finally, though his voice still carried resistance. You are wrong, Brown confirmed. But I understand why you said it. You're trying to protect something precious. I respect that. But you need to understand that there are different ways to protect it. You do it by staying raw and emotional. I do it by building an empire that nobody can take away from us. So you're saying both approaches are valid? I'm saying both approaches are necessary. We need artists like you who keep soul music rooted in real emotion, in struggle, in pain. We need that reminder of where we came from. But we also need artists like me who show that we can be sophisticated, we can be commercial, we can be successful without losing ourselves. We need both. Otis looked at him for a long moment. I still think you've smoothed out too much. And I still think you wallow in pain too much, Brown replied. But that doesn't mean we can't respect what each other is doing. I don't know if I can respect it, Otis admitted. Then don't. But stop telling me I'm not real because I found a way to succeed on my own terms. Otis turned and walked out of the studio. Brown stood there, jaw clenched, watching him go. Booker T. Jones spoke up quietly. He'll come around. Maybe, Brown said. Or maybe he won't. But I know who I am. I know what I'm building, and I don't need his approval to do it. For the next 3 years, James Brown and Otis Redding barely spoke. They'd see each other at industry events, nod politely, but the friendship was gone. Otis continued making raw, emotional soul music that critics loved. Brown continued making innovative funk that crossed over to pop charts and made him a household name. Then, in December 1967, just months after their confrontation, Otis Redding died in a plane crash at age 26. He was at the peak of his powers, having just recorded Sittin' on the Dock of the Bay. Ironically, his most commercial, most crossover song. When Brown heard the news, he locked himself in his dressing room and cried. Not because they'd reconciled, they hadn't. But because he lost someone who'd challenged him, someone who'd made him think, someone who represented a different path that was equally valid. Years later, Brown would say in interviews, Otis and I disagreed about how to navigate this industry. I thought he was limiting himself. But you know what? We were both right, and we were both wrong. The music industry needed what Otis did, that raw, pure emotion. And it needed what I did, that disciplined commercial innovation. We needed each other, even if we couldn't admit it. The lesson from that confrontation at Stax wasn't about who was right, the purist or the crossover artist. It was about understanding that there are multiple ways to honor your art, multiple ways to serve your community, multiple ways to define success. Otis Redding's way wasn't wrong. James Brown's way wasn't wrong. They were different responses to the same impossible situation, being a black artist trying to make authentic music in an industry that wanted to commercialize everything you touched. If this story about artistic integrity, commercial success, and the impossible choices artists face moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear that there's more than one way to stay true to yourself. Subscribe for more stories about legends who chose different paths. And remember, sometimes the most important debates don't have winners. They just have two people doing their best with different values.